My name is Eric Goldwyn. All right. In case anyone didn't know, you're being recorded. My name is Eric Goldwyn. I'm a professor here at New York University at the Marron Institute. This is our office. Well, this is obviously a conference room. And for the last 2.5, 3 years, we've been working on understanding transit infrastructure costs sort of in the United States. That's been sort of our mantra. And costs are high relative to other parts of the world. So we've collected a bunch of headline costs from all over the globe, work that Alon has been working on since, I think, 2008. We'll hear more about it in a little bit. And then we decided the headline costs don't tell the whole story. We really wanted to understand the mechanics of individual projects. And so based on our data of, I think it's 900 projects in about 60 countries, we discovered that some places are very cheap, some places are the median, some places are very high. And so we wanted to dig into some of those examples. So we did in-depth case studies on 4 Italian cities, Stockholm, Istanbul, and then we did New York and Boston. And so after all of that, we put together a report. We sent all of you the overview. Maybe you've read it, maybe not. It's long. And we have published all of our cases except for one that's outstanding that will come out in another month or so. And then we invited Aaron, who's been writing about this stuff for the last, I don't know, several years. He wrote a wonderful piece, I think it was like 3 years ago now, about this very issue, why are costs so high in the US. And so we thought, he would be a sort of perfect person to help us sort of talk about all this. So these are all of the research people. There are many more of us actually. Like these are the main crew. So this is Marco, Elif, and Alon, and we've worked with a lot of other people. There's Rachel, there's Yinan. I want to name everyone. Shaul.
Rashid here.
What?
Rashid here.
What? Oh yeah, Abdi Rashid. I'm sure I forgot some, but anyhow, the point is, it took a lot of people to put all this together. So thank you for coming. I'm going to take it over to Aaron, and then we'll talk more.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you all for coming. I'm very excited for this day because I remember when this project was first announced, it was right at the end of when I was writing that article that Eric referred to. So it would have been early 2020, I think, that Eric first told me about this project. And I remember he asked me if I wanted to write about the project itself, and I said, it's very exciting. Let me know when you finish and what you find. And here we are a couple of years later, and I feel like we're finally at that point. The reason I'm particularly excited about this is because when I was writing that article, or researching it, I should say, there were a lot of questions that basically nobody had looked into. There were a lot of things about why costs in the US and in New York in particular are so high that it seems like almost nobody really had answers for. And it was very frustrating as a reporter because on the one hand, open questions are exciting opportunities for reporters to find out something that isn't out there. But on the other hand, this obviously needed the work of several years of a team of researchers, which I was not. So that brings us to today. One of the first things I wanted to kind of lay out is why this subject is so important. I'm guessing if you're here, you probably already have an inkling that it's very important, but I think it's worth emphasizing a little bit. And I'll go over that just by sharing how I kind of got interested in it. I started writing about the New York City subway specifically during the summer of 2017, which those of us who probably remember was dubbed the summer of hell due to the subway just not running, not functioning on the most basic level in many cases. And I started writing about it because I had a fundamental question, which was, I was looking at the agency's annual budget and I was looking at the output of what the rider's experience was like. And I saw about $16 billion going towards running a system that didn't seem to be working. $16 billion for the MTA as a whole, and New York City Transit Authority obviously is a little bit less than that. But I thought there's a mismatch here. This seems like it should be enough money to run a good transit system. I didn't really know anything about it at the time, but that was my kind of hypothesis. And the more I dug into it, the more that seemed to be the case, that there was a lot of money that wasn't going towards improving the rider experience, towards making a better system, towards maintaining the subway and giving New Yorkers the system it deserves. And as I looked into it, an increasingly important point seemed to be coming up over and over again, but was almost never discussed when I was attending MTA board meetings, when I was hearing officials talk about the system, when I was hearing politicians discuss what was wrong with the subway. And that issue was construction costs. The people who were really paying attention to this system were saying, we can't do anything productively here. We waste a lot of money trying to build anything. And when I looked at the operating budget, I was seeing that at the time, I think it was 16% of the annual operating budget was going towards paying off debt service for projects that they had already built or were in the process of building. And what this essentially meant for riders, to put a very rough point on it, was that about 16% of their subway fare was going towards paying off debt for other projects and not towards actually running the system better. And that seemed like a huge problem to me. Obviously some debt is not a problem, but almost 20, now I think it's up to 20% almost of the agency's operating budget every single year. One out of every $5 goes straight towards paying off debt for projects that it couldn't build in a more cost-effective manner. So super obvious implications for how healthy the city can be, how well it can grow, how much it can accommodate new residents, new workers, new businesses. And I think we're seeing that now, especially in terms of housing costs and other, very real issues that New Yorkers are facing. So that was how I got into it, and how I started to view this issue. And obviously it's not just a New York issue, but it's certainly very prevalent here in New York as one of the major problems with American transportation, is that we can't build more of it in a way that enables us to rapidly expand the system quickly enough to meet our climate goals, to meet our housing goals, to meet our transportation goals. Alon, I know you've been looking into it a lot longer than I have. When did you start looking into it? How did you get interested in this?
So I'm not from the city, but I went to school here, 06 to 11. So I moved here in 06, and I have a general interest in like policy, political issues. And because I'm not American, I'm from Israel and Singapore, which are two of the most kind of inferiority complexy or cultural cringy developed countries out there, like they constantly benchmark themselves to bigger places, usually also richer places. And I get this kind of video. Okay, maybe in the US, I hear from all these, let's say, American progressives, the US problems with healthcare, poverty. Let's look at other countries. Somehow, I get interested in the subway. Essentially, I need to go to all these events. I take the subway, normal New York, right? And then I hear about Second Avenue subway under construction. Can you try to project more? Yeah. So I hear about Second Avenue subway. That would be 2007, 2008. It's under construction now. And I think, okay, this is how much it costs. Okay, high cost, but this is how much it costs to build a subway, right? But I randomly poke around and I see that it's a little cheaper in Tokyo. I see that in Tokyo, they're complaining that their construction costs, this is in the mid to late 2000s, they're complaining that their construction costs have risen to $500 million per kilometer. And as a result, they're no longer going to expand the Tokyo Metro. At the time, they had just opened what has since remained the most recently built line in the system, the Fukutoshi line. And it even costs 500, it costs, I think, 300. The next one would be 500. But wait, Second Avenue subway is more than $1 billion. Okay, Japan's cheap. And then I maybe look at Paris, London, the other giant cities that New York likes sometimes to compare itself with. And in those cities, it's also a lot cheaper. In Paris, it's not 500. In Paris, it's 250. And I keep asking New York rail fans why, and I never get satisfactory answer. So this is when I start writing about just on the internet. That in the late 2000s, early 2010s, mid 2000s, that's not my job. And I keep hearing, and I keep looking at more and more examples, and I see that even 250 is not actually cheap. I mean, I see that in Italy, I see that it's a lot cheaper. In Milan, at the time, they're building Metro Line 5 for, I think in 2022 dollars, it would be 160, 170. And then I see all these places that everyone talks about. See, for example, China is not unusually cheap. China, the examples that I found there, and since then we found literally hundreds of examples, and not short, not Second Avenue subway size example. We're talking full lines, 20, 30, 40 kilometers. And I can tell how much things cost in China. They cost basically the same as the rest of world average. India is in theory cheap, but India actually is so expensive that it mostly builds elevated trains because it cannot afford subways. And also often the major boulevards are wide enough that they could just do L's on them. But when you correct for that, their construction costs are maybe higher than world average. It's not that the third world has low wages and therefore builds cheaper.
Hold on, let's try to move it along a little bit, just because we have a lot more stuff we have to get to.
Sure. So anyway, this is what I find, and over time I figure, okay, let's try to figure out these differences. And over many years, this transformed into my getting into this full time and into the beginning of the transit cost project, where we actually figured out that we need to do very deep place studies. What exactly is the breakdown in a really expensive place like New York or Boston? And how does it compare with cheaper places like Stockholm, like Istanbul, which is absurdly cheap, or like the main cities of Italy?
Elif, how did you get into this?
So I got involved in 2020 June. I had already been doing some research in urban planning, but I hadn't gone into transportation costs, so it was new to me. And I got in the program and the group, and then I found out that like the first thing I was really struck by was how Istanbul was building for really cheap, and how it had built a lot of kilometers of rail in the last 30 years. So I started looking into it, and lots of interesting things came up. So that's how I got involved.
Yeah, I mean, more or less they came at the same time as Elif. And it's more or less the same. I mean, for me, the thing was when I moved to Canada, I live in Canada. And coming from Italy, everything was looking like I was interested in like construction cost. My background is of an architect. So everything was, why is so expensive? I mean, it's like 2-3 times. It's not just transit, it's everything. I mean, roadworks and every kind of infrastructure. And I was used like, this should cost like 40-50 million, not 150. So that's why I got like into, I think I first read like some Alon like writing. I said, okay, not the only one that was remarking that there is like a huge difference between what we see in North America and other countries and Italy or other places in Europe or around the world. So that's how I came about, like, and then things happens and I started looking.
Eric.
So Alon and I have been working together for a while. We did a Brooklyn bus network redesign. Obviously, a big fan of the work Alon had been doing on transit costs, and so we decided to try to figure out a way to build a research program around it. And that's the sort of the output that we came up with. And if you've seen the overviews, we've come up with sort of 6 sort of broad areas to focus on. Sort of politics and decision making being sort of the fundamental piece that we find in all of our cases that really determines how costs are going to change. And then downstream from politics and decision making, you have things about internal capacity at agencies. So agencies that have a lot of experience building this stuff, they know exactly what they want, are able to sort of do the job more efficiently and cheaper, especially if they've been doing it sort of continuously over time, we found. And then we look at things like utility relocation, which when I got into this, not something I was really aware of, but that's been sort of, to me, the most fascinating piece of all this is utilities and third-party agreements. And this is the stuff where you have to get approvals from the Department of Transportation, from another agency. And so that part is really important. And then the other 2 big pieces are things like labor and things like design, which we will talk more about. But that's sort of our main findings relate to those issues.
So before we get to the findings, which we obviously need to talk a lot about, I just want to make sure we get a sense of the work that went into these reports, both the case study and obviously the final report. We don't have to dwell on this. I don't want like the full bibliography, but just give me a sense for these. How many people were you talking to? What kind of research were you doing? What documents were you looking at? Like about how long would each take? Just these kinds of like top level, items.
With Marco on that one.
I mean, I think it's.
So Marco did the Italian case.
Yes,
for those.
we worked on the Italian case. I mean, it's a lot of work because you have to figure out, you have to contact people at agencies, you have to send a lot of emails and go through documents. One thing that helps, and I think especially in the Italian case, is that the level of transparency, I might surprise some people, but it's much higher than in North America. There are much more reports available. There are much more reports that have been done by government authorities that are published about cost issues, about analyzing like projects that went over budget and why, and so on. The Court of Auditors, the Anti-Corruption Authority, and so on. And there is much more availability of online documents that there is here. So, and on the side of this, a lot of interviews. I think I did like some 26, 27 like formal interviews, plus many more like informal interaction over time with people in agencies. So it's, I can't say how many hours I worked on it, but it's a lot of time.
We definitely underpaid Marco. For
And
all the work. Yes. So I worked mainly on the American cases, and I think between, we did one in Massachusetts and one in New York. We did probably 130 interviews across those two. We're much less transparent, so there's a lot of FOIL requests. I'm still waiting on some of them. To get.
So am I.
Yeah, exactly. There is a lot of documentation in cities like New York. In Boston, the project we looked at had some sort of spectacular issues, so there had been a lot of press about that. And we've been very lucky to, pester people at agencies and consultants and contractors and people who worked on this stuff. I think uniformly, a lot of people are very interested in this topic. And a lot of people with more knowledge, at least than I have, were willing to like spend time with me and try to explain some stuff.
For Istanbul, I talked to about 35 people, mostly contractors and designers, consultants also. There isn't as much documentation in Turkey as in here. Also, it's not as transparent as Italy, but the contractors were willing to share with me a lot of information. And they were actually surprised that Istanbul was cheap. Like people, especially those who didn't do work abroad, they found their costs too high. But once I started to explain, they realized that, oh yeah, okay, so this is something they're doing pretty well. So yeah, I worked for I think a year and a half on the report, and then I also worked on the other parts of the projects, the database, the visualization, the website, mapping. But Istanbul was like a year and a half and 35.
Right. So Stockholm is 10 interviews and many official and unofficial reports and academic studies. There's a thing where it's been easier for me to get Southern Europeans to answer emails and talk to me than Northern Europeans. Not sure what it means, but there's a lot of transparency in the Nordic countries. In some places things were surprised. Okay, nobody expects Italy to be transparent and very good at anti-corruption, but it is. In Sweden, people kind of stereotype it as this kind of like nirvana or lost nirvana. Is it nirvana? No, but it actually does have a decently efficient, decently transparent, clean government. If you want to know how they do procurement, they have a procurement strategy. Most of it is even in English because everything that faces pan-European or international academia or global contractors is in English. The construction sites are in English at this point, not Swedish. I think half the construction workers on the subway expansion in Stockholm are immigrants, almost entirely EU. And so Sweden was less talking to people, more reading things. But for the final report, the conclusion, things called the overview on the website. We've talked to a bunch of people from a bunch of places. Maybe I talked to one person in the Philippines or two in Singapore, a few Brits, a handful of Germans, French, Spaniards, Israelis. I think for that report, we talked in addition to the 10 people in Sweden, maybe, I don't know, 15, 20-ish, 25 people. So we're talking like 200 interviews.
Okay.
Many government reports, studies.
Oh, so the cases don't move linearly. Like, so sometimes it's intense for a couple months and then
Yeah.
a little bit of a lag.
So obviously, we have, these findings now. I think there were like, 6 recommendations, but, high, and they're fairly high level, but they also get very detailed. So like and some of them are more surprising than others. For example, wasn't shocked to learn that cut and cover is the best approach when you can do it, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cheapest approach, right?
Yeah.
But, we're in New York, so I want to kind of focus on a lot of the New York questions that are central here. And one of the takeaways that I thought was most interesting was the benefits of itemizing costs and making these as transparent as possible. As a reporter, I have obviously come across this many times reporting on the MTA. You ask how much something costs and someone can give you a high level number, but you ask for any kind of breakdown, and that's when things become a giant question mark. I remember once asking for just a breakdown of the East Side Access project beyond $11.2 billion. Like, okay, where does that money go? And this was a complete dead end. Like, just nobody could tell me where that money went. So this has been a big issue for a long time. And when I was covering it, I would see this at the board level. They'd approve a project, it would have a top level item, they'd sign off on it for $200 million, $400 million, nobody would ask a question. Then 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, they would come with some adjustments saying, it's now $283 million, or it's now $400 million, and everyone would just be like, okay. And nobody would ever itemize exactly where this money was going, what the changes were for, exactly how much was costing all this extra. It was all just very black boxy. And your report makes the argument, the findings are that itemizing the cost not only adds transparency for the public, but also adds transparency for other contractors and for potential competitors as well. So I was wondering if you could just go into a bit more detail on how you came to that realization that adding that transparency actually helps reduce prices over time and not just, create something for good government types to shout about and otherwise doesn't change anything.
This is actually an insight.
Wait, hold on, I think we should start with Marco on this.
I think one of the things, because initially it's been a thing forever having this itemized public reference cost that has been used for public works, and even like in the private sector since the 70s, they were published by the Chamber of Commerce and publicly available. And when I talked with people in Italy saying there is no such a thing in North America. Yes, there are like private companies that publish this updated quarterly things that are used by everybody, but nothing like official that used like a base reference for bidding and for evaluating the cost of public works. So we're like, how do they do? They were like, how do they manage this thing? And this, okay, this is important. This is something that has been developed in Italy. It took a while. It was like first proposed in the 70s. Then there was this big scandals in the 80s and 90s. And then, the idea was that if there is this transparency about, that 1 cubic meter of concrete of this particular characteristic food in these circumstances, and, like with a lot of parameters should cost like 70 euros per cubic meter. I'm just guessing a number. This is something that we can use as a reference. This we can put out bid with very precise upper threshold number, and so people can make, they can make, okay, we will go with 5% less, 4% less, and then we can agree on item cost, and this item cost can be used for change orders without negotiating all the time a specific cost for change orders. There is no race to the bottom, there is no evaluation, and I think it's very central because it allows to have evaluation of bids based more on technical characteristics of the contractors instead of the lowest bid. The lowest now bids in Italy comes at -4, 5, 7% compared to the estimated threshold, not like 30% as we see. But Italy had exactly the same problem we have seen here. They used to come at -30% because there were lump sum costs, and then there were a lot of these change orders. So it's very interesting because it's a tool of transparency. Things are on the table. We know how much things should cost. Be aware. We know that there is an update mid-year. They are renovated every year. An update mid-year for a material cost and so on. So it's very cumbersome. It took 20 years to oil this procedure down. It can look very bureaucratical from a North American perspective, but it really is something that makes people compete not on cost, not a race to the bottom, but a better how we can improve the way we do things, so we can get a better price. Contractors can do, okay, I have a new machine to lay down tracks, Alstom track for tramways, so we can save on the platform of the tramway, and so I can bid at 7% less on this instead of 2% less. So I think this is very interesting, and it's something that really a lot, and it's a tool of equate the markets. I'm going into the market, we public agencies, we're going to the market, and we know how much things cost. Be aware, contractors. You cannot fool us. This is a bit more or less how it works.
And so I read about this, I don't remember when, maybe 2010. There was, I found this, I think, a 6-page note by the CEO of Madrid Metro from 20 years ago, Manuel Medina. He was the person who was in charge when they built, I forget how much they built, but they're like 100-something kilometers of subway. That maybe in today's money, after inflation, it might be 100 million a kilometer, but might still be less than that. He has this note that everyone in US reporting talks about the construction costs, cites that, and then ignores anything else there. And he says, itemized costs don't do lump sum. He explains it in terms of change orders. Something that Marco just said. And in the United States, the lump sum contracts are very contentious. Change orders are incredibly contentious. They're litigated. There are contractors that specialize in bidding low and then making money on change orders. Quite a lot of contractors say that the only way you can make money in the US is on change orders. And the risk just means that people bid higher. Any kind of risk you impose on the factors will just lead them to bid more the first time. And these procurement problems are a giant cost increaser in the US, and I think also in the rest of the English-speaking world, for everything. That's not just building a new subway. If you want to build an elevator, if you want to make a subway station accessible, which sadly very little in New York City is, that's a procurement contract. If you want to build platform edge doors so that people don't fall on the tracks or don't get pushed on the tracks, that's a contract that you need to procure. So all these procurement problems, for which itemizing is one of their recommendations, all of these, we think they double the cost.
The other thing I just want to add quickly is, so a lot of departments of transportation at the state level for road projects do use itemized costs and sort of these reference prices that contractors can sort of bid to. And a lot of contractors that do both sides of projects prefer working with state DOTs. This is a big thing in Washington State currently with their transit agency.
Interesting. So I think one of the other big takeaways from the report has to do with the political and incentive alignment with politics and with agencies. Now, Eric, I think when we talked about this, you kind of mentioned that, like, you had mixed feelings about having that be such a huge takeaway, because on some level it's on some level it's beyond the scope of the report, but in another level it's completely unavoidable that this is a huge issue and a key driver of construction costs.
I don't know who's talking, but
Yeah.
hello. Yeah, it is a very unsatisfying answer to say politics and decision making drive all these costs. But I think what we saw so clearly, and I love this line in the overview, is, I'm going to butcher it, of course, but you want to macro manage at the political level rather than micromanage. And I think in our Boston case, in our New York case, and in some of the work I've been doing out in Seattle, what you see is a lot of elected officials and a lot of non-technical experts getting very involved in choosing a locally preferred alternative for the alignment of a route, or fighting back about, well, we need this betterment in this municipality because that's the municipality I represent, which Los Angeles, LA Metro, Sound Transit, their boards are made up of elected officials, right? So they're very invested in all the other stuff that comes along with it. And here in New York, if you look at the funding for phase 1 of Second Avenue Subway, like Governor Pataki and Sheldon Silver had to have a big fight about some of that stuff, and things down the line too. And so what we found in some of our cases, and obviously I'd like for others to talk about, is yes, the elected officials have to approve a multi-$100-million budget, but after that there's a master plan that in Istanbul they create, or in Milan, and they just allocate the money accordingly. And it's not sort of a fractious fight every single time.
There was a great line in the report that, was to the effect of, in the US, every time a politician intervenes in these projects to micromanage it, it's always in a way that adds costs or increases the scope, and it's never in a way that fights to reduce the scope or make the project more efficient. There are obviously lots of political incentive reasons that, make it very obvious why that's the case, but I think it's a very telling example of how politicians view public work projects in the US, I think, that they view it as something to extract political capital from rather than to intervene for a more public service purpose, if you will.
So a quick example of that, Sound Transit has a $50+ billion capital program, and they are over budget, delayed, and you talk to the board members that are all elected officials, they are unwilling to sacrifice on scope, happy to delay and add costs, because that doesn't matter as much as saying, we're going to just get rid of this light rail stop or whatever. They don't want to make that sacrifice. But I think what I hope with our research is that, understanding those trade-offs can make for better decision making.
I want to ask Elif about the political aspect here, because if I'm not mistaken, you're the only one who did a detailed report on a country that we might not consider perfectly, a democracy. But there's some kind of interesting interplay between, I think, the local government and national government that, happens in a low-cost city, but it seems to have kind of, mixed takeaways. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Politics is a big part of rail construction in Istanbul. So both left and right-wing governments in Istanbul, they are proud to build rail. So everybody definitely wants to promise more rail lines. And in the city, both the central government, which is currently right-wing AKP, and the local government, they build rail, but they do it separately, and they don't support each other's projects. They look for funding separately. So there's kind of this competition over who will build more and who will promise more. They even recently decided to create different logos for the two different governments' rail. So now one has a U, the other has an M. So it's a big fight. But like this kind of fight also makes it easier to build in a way, because everybody wants it and everybody wants it done quickly. Nevertheless, of course, it also brings up issues like when the current local government wanted to build, went out looking for funding, they had to get it approved by the central government first. And until now, like in 2019, the local government changed from the right-wing AKP, same with the central, to the left-wing as it is today. And until then, it was easy for them to get approvals because it was the same party, basically. But since İmamoğlu came into power, they couldn't get their approval. They had to wait for applying for European loans. And finally, they had to issue bid bonds to be able to cover the financing of the rail line. So it's also an issue in Istanbul, but in some ways it also helps. Like there's a lot of pressure on contractors to finish things as soon as possible. Usually they try to time it so that it coincides with the national holiday or like something big, so that they have a big publicity like an event. But it's something that also Istanbul has to deal with.
So the whole point of this report and this project and this years of work for you guys is to provide a roadmap, lessons learned, so that cities like New York and other places in the US can start building transit more affordably. I was wondering if you guys have any examples of other cities around the world that have successfully gone from being a high-cost city to a medium or low-cost city? And if so, what are the specific lessons from that transition that New York and other US cities have to learn from? Marco, you've already talked about the itemization aspect in Italy. I think that's a great example. Are there other things like that that stick out to you guys as something New York could very specifically learn from?
Well, I think the example from our cases is Italy, where their costs were quite high. And I'll let Marco take over from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, so maybe you know a bit of the big corruption scandal that happened in the late 80s and early 90s in Italy, and many involved like subway construction projects. So it's really, there was a reaction from politics, slow and not very straightforward always, but there was a reaction, a big reform of the procurement law in 1994, going away from like non-competitive procurement that was done extensively in the 80s. And even tackling, I mean, the thing is really that there was like in this first reform in 1994, another reform of the public administration in 1999, and then a second reform of the public procurement in 2006, and then another like fixing in 2010, and then another in 2016. The thing is really, problem emerges all the time. The thing is really like more or less the institutional system in Italy has come to try to tackle all these aspects that emerge. Like, for example, this third parties agreement and utilities coordination, we have seen a lot in New York, in other cases in North America. It's something that happened in Italy. Projects have been stalled forever because of these interagency conflicts and so on, but they put up in 1991. It was a problem that everybody was talking about, like we can't get projects through because we have to get an agreement, and then the people get an agreement, they have to go back to the first one and so on. So they set up this thing that is called a conference of service, where everybody that is involved in the project has to give some kind of approval. They get in. If they don't show up, they don't show up. They approve the project as it is. And really, there are a lot of like fine-tuning that has been done over time. And it's really, you come here, you say what you want to say, you approve the project, and then the project goes on. Because this is really something that has been like devolved to regions after, you know, like it's a process, but I think it's the most important thing is a lot of this fixing that kind of came out, like a lot of this, how to tackle, how to make procurement, how to evaluate bids and everything. Just something that has been like in the discourse forever. Everybody had this idea that has to be tackled. It has to be tackled not at the agency level, not at the city level, and so on. It's more something that you have to create a framework, a legal framework, through like legislation, through like, I don't know, states or federal legislation to tackle this problem, and like best practices trying to share. So it's a very long process, but I think that the thing is really, you have first to acknowledge that there is a problem, and then what is the problem? What are the several overlaid problems? And then how do we solve this? How do we solve this? And Italy went out to see like best practices in Europe and things like that. So it's not like working in the void. So,
and I think building off of that, based on like our interviews with people in North America, you know, Alon and I have done a lot of interviews with heads of capital construction at different agencies, and we get, so I would say, 3 sets of responses from people. One group will say, this is crazy, we need to fix this. One group will say, these aren't apples to apples comparisons. Like, we can't compare this place to that place. I'm not going to address this. And then another person would be like, I don't really know what's going on outside of my world because I'm very busy trying to fix all these millions of problems. And I think what comes out of what Marco is saying is that, yeah, you have to acknowledge that there's a problem. You know, like our federal government sort of did a study about construction costs. I don't remember, it was 5 years ago, something like that. But part of the conclusion, if I'm remembering correctly, was like, we can't do this work. And so they sort of gave up. And I think in Italy, they were like, this is a problem. People recognize it as a problem. Elected officials recognize it as a problem. And so there was that sort of continuous momentum to, you know, solving that problem. And I think here we're not at that. Well, maybe we're at that point. I don't know. But and when I say here, I mean the US. But I don't think that we're really at that point yet. And until we get to that point, I think it's very hard to sort of unpack.
I mean, that brings up a kind of like central conundrum of the research, I think, which is, you know, if a lot of these solutions have to come from politicians, from high levels of government recognizing the problem, and in a democracy, you know, they're supposed to take their cues from the voters in theory. If the voters are not particularly motivated about the problem, and I think that's absolutely the case in the US. I mean, if you ask people if high transit construction costs ranks on their top 10 issues in the US today, I don't think you would get a lot of people who say yes. It might be true in cities that rely on transit. There aren't that many of them, and they don't constitute very many voters. So, you know, relative to the country as a whole. So, I mean, how do we get out of this vicious cycle almost? Is it to focus less on the problems of transit construction costs specifically and just high costs in general and construction in the country as a whole? Is it to focus on lack of efficiency and, you know, government? Like, what's the answer here?
I think what motivated us, you know, and it's specifically when Alon and I started talking about this, was we just need to shine light on this and talk about it more and have people like you talk about it and have, people like you talk about it. I think that's how you start. I don't know, Alon, if you have.
Yeah, I mean, in New York, the city is such a big part of the state. And the city and the suburbs are the majority of the state. Yeah, I think people care. In Massachusetts, Charlie Baker has spent a lot of effort on being seen as someone who cares about efficiency. I don't think he's done a good job at all, but he tries to be seen as that. I think in California, people are trying to take a stab at it just because of the slow failure of California high-speed rail. Federally, I know a lot of people care about high-speed rail in the Northeast corridor, even people who are not even Northeastern maps. So I believe just because all of these issues are connected, somewhat different from road issues, talking about, is that I think people would be interested. I mean, I'm not going to say, okay, this is the polling on this 538 average says that this is a 64.23% chance, but
It's also all the things that we don't have as a result of the high cost. One of the things that we've also been looking at is sort of what would it look like if you could bring costs down to a certain level? Like what else could you build in the city like New York? What, Sound Transit could get, their capital program done instead of in, I think 2040, whatever is the end date, maybe it could get it done in 15 years instead of the 30 years that it had sort of marked. LA Metro has, a huge program. San Francisco, similarly, like all these places. And then there are all these projects around the country that just don't get out of the planning stage because the costs just are too high. North Carolina has a couple light rail projects that have been sort of, squandered because of this sort of issue. And I think that's the thing is that once people understand that this high costs preclude the development of all this stuff, then you start to understand, okay, this is an important issue. And I think it's, people like us who are trying to translate that as best as we can into sort of a way that is accessible.
yeah, exactly. I mean, places like, for example, high-speed trains, right? I mean, you cannot ride a high-speed train between LA and San Francisco, but if California high-speed rail had been done better, by now you could have done so. New York and Washington, New York and Boston, specific subway lines that kind of around the city knows should be built, but there's no money for them because they cost billions per kilometer and not 200 million a kilometer. Like if you live on Utica Avenue or if you live on Millstone Avenue, south of the subway, south of Flatbush, yeah, I mean, you're getting a subway if New York and even mildly or just
I want to make sure we have time for questions. So we have about 15 minutes, I think, maybe. If anyone has any. Yeah, go ahead.
In the final report, I noticed you didn't focus much on the importance of the structure of American environmental laws. Certainly, as someone who worked in California on transit projects, it seems to be a big driver of the bad and politicized decision making that you identify. To what extent do you think that's true, and what could be done better to, retain the environmental protection while not, causing problems with these projects?
So in California, there was a big environmental lawsuit by people on the peninsula who were suing mostly on NIMBY grounds. They did not want the trains near them, and they actually had a fair amount of technical merit, and they still lost because these are not environmental laws; these are lawsuits. So Marco, you can talk more about how this works in Italy, because in Italy it's a lawsuit-free process.
In Italy, it's more of a technical bureaucratical process in the sense that mostly it's handled at the regional level because, like, especially transit projects that remain within built-up areas are not subject to the full procedure, are subject to a kind of expedited procedure, relatively expedited. But it's mostly something managed by like the regional environmental agency that is staffed by people, like expert in noise, like particulates or whatever. And it's mostly like an evaluation of impacts of the project and how to mitigate them and stay within the general regulations that are imposed by the EU and national and European level. So it's more like a check, like, is your project compatible with the law we have? How are you mitigating, like during construction, after construction, before and after what's made. And it's not, for example, it's untied for the public participation process, unlike in the US. The public participation process exists. It's called the public debate, and it's handled differently. It has evolved over time, but it's different. It's not something you do within, like, studying a lot of micro alternatives that are almost the same, like just the station on the one side or the other state. There is no such a thing. There are a study of alternatives that is more done on like a technical base, and then there is some debate about it. But like it's more like people that are expert on the matter and say, okay, check.
So I think on the environmental thing in the US, there are a couple of different things. One is, I think leadership is a big part of it. I think capacity at sort of the FTA is another part of it, where agencies do get their work done and are waiting for decisions and they just don't come back in time. Also, elected officials not wanting to select an alternative, asking to study more and kicking the process back, right? Like if you look at the NEPA process, I'm going to get this probably a little bit wrong, but I think you can do it in 18 to 24 months with 2 meetings. Now, if you look at, say, Sound Transit's, their environmental process timelines, like their goal for their newest expansion program is 4 to 4.5 years. No project has met that, except one. Their previous thing, like they're going 6, 7, 8 years out, and it's because their board doesn't want to make certain decisions. They want to extend the comment period. They want to, add all these other things, which are not by law things that you necessarily need to do. And I think Aaron recently wrote about, some of these issues in one of his articles. So I think there are things that are about the process, but it's also the way that we apply it and execute it that sort of exacerbates these issues.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick note, since I did write an article about it, is that nobody knows what to expect of the legal process, which is a huge problem with environmental reviews, and is a big reason why agencies feel like they have to do a billion public meetings, study every conceivable alternative, because they have to make it quote unquote bulletproof for the inevitable lawsuits that will come, which are kind of like endemic to just the American system in general. Like getting rid of lawsuits is just like not really a feasible thing that we can do given our kind of system of government and what people expect of it. So one of the best ideas I heard when I was researching is like Utah just created a water court essentially to adjudicate all disputes relating to water law. So now there are going to be these judicial judges, but they're experts on water law. Right now, when you file an environmental review, it's going before like any judge, and they might know something about an environmental law. They might know very little about it. They might have never adjudicated a case before. They might let their people, and if they happen to live in the near where the law is, near where the process is going to influence it too. It's just nobody knows what kind of judge you're going to get and what their expertise is going to be on environmental law, and so that drives a lot of the extra work that goes into all of it. So I think if agencies knew what to expect from the legal process, that would help a lot.
So I think going to Alon's point is that a lot of times these lawsuits are put forward, but they do fail.
Yes.
And so
When the state fights, they fail.
Yeah.
When the state fights.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. And so if you could turn around that process more quickly sometimes.
Exactly. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe just to reframe some of these, first of all, thank you for the work. My background has been in the construction of utilities, electric and gas utilities, implementing damages to them. So there was some research that I came across at Yale that termed this environmental as the issues around environmentalism as citizen voice, right? And so these are issues of, and also my work has been on addressing issues of worker safety, right? So these are these issues of citizen voice and labor voice, and the way I'm interpreting that is that in the US these voices are heard, and the costs are maybe heard to a larger extent than say other countries. And so maybe the costs when building out transit is actually there are these additional costs in hearing these voices, right? And so, for example, the amount of time and effort that's put into place to ensure worker safety on a site may be considerable in the United States context, whereas it's not as extensive in Italy or other countries for that matter. Has that come across, when you're normalizing these projects across issues of citizen and labor voice, how do you tackle that normalization?
I mean, construction sites in Sweden are safe. I mean, The issue with citizen voice, it's not that it makes things safer, it's that just the endless rounds of reviews of every local notable who feels like their opinion must be addressed. It's designed by committee, except it's not a committee of 8 people at odds with one another, but many more people in many such committees is the main citizen voice problem. We've seen it in other parts, things that are not related to safety, just for example, stations.
I also think, it's a process versus outcome sort of debate, and it's possible that we've gone too far in one direction and, we'll correct or not. I would argue that, yeah, I think there's maybe too much process and we lose sight of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, right? When we decided to build a subway or a light rail or whatever, and it's voted on by the public as it is in Los Angeles or in Seattle oftentimes, like people have spoken in theory, right? So that should be a clear mandate to move forward, but it's not. And I think worker safety in Italy is probably quite high, but I don't know.
I mean, I think it's more like, it has to be differentiated between like people and, because a lot of we see with utilities or like third parties agreement, like railway road, for example, in Canada, we see this a lot. It's not people, it's big corporate that extorts a lot of things from this because there is not a framework. They can absolutely ask for everything or impose their standard, like having like 4 supervisors on site or like delaying things. We have a lot of these examples. And if there is not a legal framework that entitle agency to say, you are here, if you're not here, you'll be fined or whatever, we will move it our own. And if something happens, it's your responsibility. And if it's something like, it's corporate power, I'm more expert of, I'm seeing what happens in Canada. It's really, when you deal with railroads, you just go with your hat and say, beg to do things. Because this is what the law allows, like, municipalities or other public bodies that are like doing transit project to do. And this is not really people, it's really corporates that really extracts this. Then there are like, of course, this kind of, examples of like people like getting hurt. And my impression is that in North America, agencies are like headless in the sense that they don't have much of political cover because they are like with these boards with a lot of jurisdiction across. And in Italy, for example, and in other cases, like the centrality of municipal government. So if the mayor is behind you, you can do this. The mayor and the city council. And so this really helps a lot.
Go ahead.
I have a question for the people who like dealt with the New Yorkers. Did you find any, among the high level people you spoke with, or did you find any interest or concern about what you were studying? Like you were asking them questions, have they been interested in your work?
I'd say absolutely. I think there is a mix. Some people know, but some people absolutely very interested and asking lots of questions about, different things for sure.
Yeah, I have a question. It always struck me as strange, and this is really, I guess, a New York and United States question, that unlike utilities where you have a private company that's regulated, there is no regulation of the Port Authority, the MTA, outside its board. And you sort of have an MPO that staples together what the agency wants to do. Are there sort of institutional arrangements in other societies that work better than letting the agencies and the governors run themselves?
So in Sweden, the agencies not only run themselves, but are very powerful. There's a very strong tradition of deference to the civil service. And in some cases, literally the only recourse is the absolute head of the agency who has a million other things to worry about. The main control is that the government might say, no, we're not funding this. The big yes, no decisions on mega projects are always political. Right now in Sweden, they just elected the right-wing government. The right-wing government said environmentalism is for hippies or something. We're not going to build high-speed rail. I mean, high-speed rail is also very controversial. They didn't say we're going to cancel all the subways in Stockholm. So there's that level of control. But it's not just adding yet another regulator. As you said, the MPOs in theory regulate, but in practice, it's like having the civil service regulate itself.
I think to your point, one of the things that is unique to the US compared to Istanbul, Italy, and Sweden is that transit agencies tend to be these funky regional scale, like in Istanbul and in the Italian cities, it's those cities that are doing the projects, right? And so what'd you say?
In Stockholm, it's the county,
Stockholm,
but the
it's
county is like a viable regional level of government. There are county governments. It's about conservatives within the metro area. So it's not the weird region like the MBTA region or Sound Transit.
Right, but so there's clear accountability, and it's clear, like, so.
Yeah,
I was looking at a project in North Carolina that, again, this sort of funky scale it's at. And they tried to get the governor of North Carolina to get involved, and he was like, this is a local concern, I'm not touching this. And Sound Transit similarly in Washington State, they're having some issues, it's like, can you get the governor involved? No, that it's not the right scale. And I feel like, what we just heard in Istanbul is that the mayor is leading the charge, right? And, he's not out there shoveling and, banging heads with the utility company, but he has supported it, right? And it's very clear that that's there. And in the US in general, the scale of our transit issues is just a little strange, I would say.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks, Aaron. I do wonder, maybe only Eric can answer this since he's the only American up there, but the report and the executive summary of this goes into a lot of these agencies need to build capacity and kind of junior level staff members, people who can then, when they rise through the ranks, they know how to oversee these projects very well and make sure that things aren't just getting totally haywire. Are we in a position where we can even ask an agency like the MTA to do that right now? I mean, we're hearing a lot of horror stories about working with the government, about coming austerity budgets and people just leaving. We had just hiring freeze at the MTA that they're barely getting out of right now. I mean, is that something that is going to be a going concern in the future?
I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to hand it off to Marco about something, because I think there's something interesting that he'll add. So to your question about, do we have the capacity at agencies currently? So I think one thing that we've seen at American agencies is there has been a sort of, what's the right way to phrase this? Sort of, a withering out, of capacity. So just to use the MTA as a quick example, like there used to be an entity at New York City Transit called CPN that had things like 1,600 people working there, and they did 90% of their construction management. I'm getting these numbers a little bit wrong, I'm sure. And I think 60% of the design that they do. But in the early 2000s, there was a change in the structure of that agency. And this has been followed by pretty much every North American agent, well, maybe I shouldn't say North American, every US agency, Sound Transit, LA Metro, they definitely work in this way too, where they are much leaner on the in-house capacity and much more reliant on consultants to sort of do a lot of the work for them. And one of the things that we found in talking to people was that oftentimes at the agency level, they don't always know what it is that they want, and they rely on the consultant to sort of define the problems for them and solve a lot of sort of these issues. And in our Italian case, one of the things that I think was most striking is that in Milan, there's an entity called Metropolitana Milanese that is, it's a publicly owned corporation. And they do all of the design, management, and planning for not just subways, but also I think it's water projects too now. And they also do work with other Italian cities. And I think that there's something in that model that would be very interesting. And can you tell us more about it?
I think it's interesting because it was set up in 1955 when the city decided to develop for real the metro. And so they have been doing most of the design, not all the design, but like a consistent part. They do use consultants for specific issues, very particular expertise, or sometimes they outsource some work because they don't have enough people in the peak of the work. But they do have an expertise. They do have a stable amount of 30, 40 people that are mostly engineers or people like technical people. And it's very interesting because they consulted almost in every project in Italy. So they were involved because they were the first one developing subway network in an Italian city. So and other cities have been like taking the example. Now Turin has its own agency that is dealing with like transit projects, like rail-based transit project. There are also like on a regional level on some regions that deal with rail or road projects, like let's say a DOT here, but having like all the project and in staff, like people that can do not maybe all of the work. I mean, they outsource part of it. There are different models. For example, Turin that does not have the same streamline of projects because it's a much smaller city. They do like work a bit more like expanding and shrinking depending on the needs. But it's interesting because they can keep the expertise in-house because it's a very specific expertise. I mean, when people get an expert in like having like fire regulations for subways, how can they do something else? I mean, it's a very specific core thing, but the thing is really they can advise other people on this. They advise it like for Riyadh Metro, they advise it internationally also. So they work as a corporation. It's an engineering firm, but it's owned 100% by the city. They consult in Italy and abroad, and they have a kind of fixed contract with the city where they give them a 28% fixed rebates on the official fare. So they get the contracts directly, the stream of and I think it's interesting because you keep this expertise within the perimeter of the public administration, because for example, when Italy it was a matter of reforming the fire code for subways in 2015, they made an advisory board where there were people from this agency, from other agencies, and also from the private sector to counsel on how to, based more or less on an FPA 130, but with some kind of adaptation to the local context. So it's really a pool of expertise that is, because it's this idea that, you know, like the public is just a buyer, a client, a simple client that goes to the supermarket and buy a project, buy a rolling stock, buy something. And if it's not a client knowledgeable enough to do this, they will get duped. I mean, not duped, but I mean, they cannot really deal with people that are selling them.
And I think the counter side of this is from our Istanbul case where, well, I'll leave sort of.
Also, the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, they have evolved their internal capacity over the years, so that now actually they don't do anything in-house either. They're also a relatively small team, but they've become a good client, like Marco is talking about. So first, initially, actually, the operating agency on the rail building was the same team, and in the 2000s, they separated. And then the team grew. They also separated the Asian and the European sides, rail building work. And then I guess the biggest thing they did was to establish a rail projects director department, which only deals with the preliminary planning process. And they found that this benefited them a lot. So the way they procure projects is they do design build, but first they procure this preliminary design project at 60% design. And then with that document, the agency gets enough knowledge and expertise on the project so that like they have a good command over it, and they go to tenders with this knowledge. And they found that this really helped them optimize the process, optimize station designs. Like this change, just to have this focused team of 30 or 40 people of this projects department really helped them over the years. So it's not like a huge team or anything, and they don't actually cultivate like specialized professionals to do any of the actual work, but they've become a good client, and like now they know how to procure this all the different parts of the job well.
And the other part is that Istanbul's built, or is planning to build 300 kilometers or 160 miles, let's call it 150 miles of rail over the last 30 years. And so like there's a thick ecosystem of expertise within that city that also knows what they're doing and understands sort of the rules of engagement.
Yeah, so there hasn't been a conscious decision to, okay, we're building like really expansively and let's get the costs down or let's optimize. It rather evolved over the years because of such a thick ecosystem and because of so many kilometers of rail being built. And there's been also a lot of competition among the contractors. So everyone learned over the years, and now they have a very streamlined process. They are much better optimized stations, as I was saying. So this also helps. I mean, it's different evolution, but it also changed over the years.
I think in theory, there should be lunch.
It should,
outside.
yeah, there, it should be, we can talk more.
Yeah, but
There,
we,
there's
but
food
we'll be
either
out
out
there.
that door or this door. I don't know where they put it.
Yeah, if people, but I just wanted to make that aware if anyone was super hungry, but
Yeah,
we can do
take
more
us- we can
questions.
stop. We have the room for a while and we all are sort of have stamina to go. It's not there. I think it's probably, it's over there. It's over there. So if you'd like to get some food, you can get some food. I'm gonna get some food, so I will lead. I will lead by example.
Yeah, I feel bad when I don't eat cookies on screen. I have one other.